Hello.
Hey.
Welcome to Birth and Baby Talk. I'm Leanne Palmerston from Hamilton Family Doulas, and
I'm Meghan Bowser-Taylor from Family Doulas of Ottawa.
Welcome, Megan, and welcome everyone. Today we're talking about unexpected cesareans and how to deal with that.
Yeah, so the cesarean rates in Canada hover usually around 28%. So it's not like a super small number. There's quite a few parents who have their baby via cesarean. And I think it's a really important thing to talk about. I know it's really kind of close to me. I had 2 unexpected cesarean births with my 2 children. So it's definitely like throws you a little bit of a curveball. And not only the physical recovery from a cesarean, but the emotional recovery from a cesarean is not talked about a lot. So we'll start by talking a little bit about, why people have C-sections. So there's a few different kinds of C-sections. There's a planned C-section, which we won't talk about today because that's a little bit different. We don't really have elective, technically, cesareans in Canada. It's not like you get to stroll up in there and be like, hey, I want a cesarean. Like, it doesn't really work like that. So there's unplanned cesareans, and then, so that's one section. And then there's another section where it's like emergency. Sometimes they call them crash cesareans. Sometimes they're called stat cesareans, and that's a little bit different. So the most common thing we see in an unplanned cesarean birth is failure to progress. So that's where your contractions aren't strong enough. So, your dilation isn't coming, the effacement isn't there, or your contractions are really good and hard. And for whatever reason, it's just not doing anything, right? You're not getting anywhere. It's taking too long to get there. In reality, we can't be in labor forever. Right. At some point, the baby has to be born. Those kind of fall under unplanned because no one's really in danger. Like mom and baby are fine, but it's just going on and on and on and on. That's usually what we see in an emergency cesarean. Those are usually, there's been like a really big decel in the heart rate for baby. There might be hemorrhaging. There might be a prolapsed cord, there might be a concern about a uterine rupture. So those things that are really serious that they really need to get the baby out, and that's quite different.
And I find too, even within that, so there's the unplanned last minute cesarean, right? Where, maybe your blood pressure went way out of whack and the decision is just made, given all circumstances, it's better to go into a C-section. Or the baby decides it wants to try to come out butt first or back first.
Yeah.
And that, and the doctors are just not having it. And baby's in a position that nobody is comfortable allowing a natural birth to progress. Or you had a placenta that was kind of, you thought was a little close to the cervix, and it really was. It stayed really close or even covering part of the cervix. So those are ones where you don't know right away that you're going to have the C-section. Is really kind of a last minute choice. And then, of course, in the labor, when we talk about, they're called emergency, but in my experience, a real emergency birth is pretty rare, right? So things like ruptures and things can happen. And when that happens, birth has to happen really fast.
Quickly, yeah.
Yeah, and people get rushed down the hall and everybody goes running.
Yeah.
Most of the time, I'm sure you can attest that when the decision is made that, this baby kind of probably needs to come out a different way. It's almost it's a very calm and controlled.
Oh yeah. And it's usually there's usually a conversation. Usually the doctor comes in and they check you and they're like, nothing's really going anywhere, and we don't really think that it's going to go anywhere vaginally. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about a cesarean. This is what we think, and it is. You're right. It's very calm. It's nothing crazy. People aren't flying around the room in a situation like that. I mean, we as doulas have seen situations where people are flying around the room and it's really serious, and that's a whole different kind of vibe and journey. But you're right. Most of the time, the unplanned cesareans that aren't true emergencies are kind of just like another step in the labor process.
Yeah. And I think it kind of takes a lot of parents, first-time parents who have no experience with this stuff. I think it takes a lot of them by surprise. The doctor says, we've been pushing for 2 hours and the baby's heart rate has been dropping. And while that can be normal, we're still not super close to this baby being born. And we have some concerns. And we think a C-section is the best way to get the baby out because we're concerned about that baby's heart. And then parents think, okay, here we go. We're about to leave the room and go to surgery. And it's often like 30 or 40 minutes later before they actually get wheeled into the operating room because there's a whole lot of things that generally have to happen. And most babies, most of the time the decision is made far enough in advance that most babies aren't in imminent danger.
Absolutely.
And I think that's really important because when people talk about, I had an emergency section, my baby's heart rate was crashing. I think a lot of people think, oh my God, like the whole hospital rushed to save us.
Right.
It's kind of like, okay, so there's a form that we'd like you to sign. And the nurse is going to come in and I know you already had like an IV antibiotics. We're going to give you a new one.
Yeah.
And we're going to turn your epidural up. And
they give you like the anti-nausea medication. They're like, we're going to give you all this stuff to eat.
We're
like,
going to take your partner down to a change room and get them to put scrubs on. And
it's fairly like
what's going on.
Yeah, there's a bit of a process. And I also think parents kind of like feel like they're not going to get the same post-birth interaction with their baby. And in some cases they don't if it's a real emergency. But I mean, especially in the last 10 years or so, I mean, in most hospitals, you still get skin to skin. We had a client who had an unplanned cesarean a couple weeks ago. Dad got to cut the cord, which I've actually never seen before in a cesarean. So I was quite excited about that. Yeah. So there's, you get to take photos of your baby. Like as long as everyone is healthy, it's fine. I mean, it's still a birth. It's still your birth, right? The birth of your baby. It's still beautiful. It's still lovely. It's obviously done a little bit differently, but I mean, in most cases, you all go to recovery together. Like I've seen, after a cesarean where mom is obviously wheeled into recovery because she cannot walk. But dad like follows carrying the baby and it's a really cool moment, right? It's still a really lovely thing. Yeah. So yeah, like I think I do feel like people, especially if you're the type of person who wants all the information about birth before you go in, that I don't think you should skip that section of the class or the book or whatever. I think you should be really open to that because, I mean, babies are born via cesarean all the time and there's nothing wrong with that. Having said that, though, there is a lot of kind of emotions that come with an unplanned C-section. Like physically, obviously, you have a different kind of physical recovery. You spend longer in the hospital. I think it's a little bit lost on people that it is really a really serious abdominal surgery. Like we're not, and I mean, it's not to say that vaginal births aren't, don't need recovery as well. But like this is you had surgery, and I think people kind of like forget that, like when they're talking about it.
I think when I started studying birth professionally, and I had a really in-depth look at what exactly was involved in a C-section. I think I was under this hazy impression that you cut the skin and then pull the baby out. You go through about 6 layers of different tissue,
muscle,
and pulling aside organs, and there's a lot of things that go on, and a lot of layers that have to then either be repaired or accounted for. As they're cut through or separated and moved and then put back together. And then all of that, of course, it's not simply a surface scar and a bit of muscular tissue that has to knit back together. It's these multiple layers.
Yeah.
And they also, all those different layers there's certain concerns around them. Certain layers can adhere to things. And and cause some issues. And we're going to talk next week. I think if you are interested, folks, in the issue of cesarean birth, we're going to talk to two people who from Myofascial Mississauga. We're going to talk about C-section scars very specifically.
Oh, nice.
And helping those scars heal so they don't do things like adhere and pull and cause sort of discomfort and problems in the recovery. So there's all this, there's like the seriousness that nobody really realizes.
Yeah, and I think on your point about like moving organs and things like that around, because of the proximity to your bladder, that's why post-cesarean, everyone is really concerned about your ability to pee on your own. So you've had a catheter put in because you're going to surgery, but there's a lot of concern around that. It's like they want you to pee, they want you to pass gas, they want you to have a bowel movement. They want to make sure everything is moving and doing what it's supposed to do. So there is, and then afterwards there's there's a good balance between like rest and like walking and like stretching your muscles. And so it's kind of like, we don't want you to lift anything heavier than the baby for 6 weeks, but we also don't want you to stay in bed for 6 weeks. Like you have to like get up and move around, and really simple things like getting into the shower in your house and stepping, if you have a bathtub, stepping over that bathtub, it hurts. Like and you're still dealing with, it's not like you're not dealing, you're still like, there's still post-pregnancy bleeding, like all of that remains the same. Just probably your vagina doesn't hurt as much as like your scar. Right? Yeah.
Sure.
So, there's a lot of physical recovery that comes with that. And I think when we talk about emotional recovery from cesareans, I think a lot of it comes from, and everyone probably feels a little bit differently than everyone feels differently about their birth. But I think it's okay to tell birthing people that it's okay to grieve or mourn the birth that you didn't have.
Yeah.
Right. So some people leave a cesarean feeling like they failed, right? That they didn't work hard enough, that their body didn't do what it was supposed to do. And in the end, they couldn't actually push a baby out. And I think that there's a lot of stigma attached to that. And like, I know from personal experience, and I'm sure some of the listeners who have had cesareans can attest to this, that you will tell your birth story and people will follow it by saying, I'm sorry. Like, oh, I had to have a cesarean. And they're like, oh, I'm really sorry. And then that was really shocking to me. I was like, I don't know why you're sorry. And I think it just, I don't know why people say that. I think they feel like maybe because you had to go into surgery or something. But yeah, I think there's a lot of stigma attached to that. And you can often feel like you failed a bit in that department.
Yeah. I think in part that probably comes from the fact that virtually all of us, as we're planning our births, those of us who know that we're getting a shot at a vaginal delivery.
Yeah.
I think few of us ever really, truly like prepare ourselves like, oh, and are looking forward to like, oh, I get a shot at having a C-section.
Yeah.
Nobody really is approaching birth that way. And so I think when a person says, oh, I have an unexpected or an emergency or an unplanned C-section, what they're hearing is, oh, my goal was not met. My birthing goal was not met.
Yeah.
Or the plan that I had laid for myself did not come to fruition, and we had to do something different, which is always a default sort of negative position. Like, we couldn't go to Canada's Wonderland, kids, so we went to Barney's backyard Ferris wheel. Like,
right. Yeah.
It's almost seen as kind of like a consolation prize. Like, oh,
yes.
At least you had something.
Which is interesting because we don't always have that reaction to people. Because honestly, it is rare that someone's birth plan goes exactly how it's supposed to go. And we never apologize for people who have had, a really serious tear or maybe a forceps delivery or anything like that. We don't usually follow it.
If someone told me they had a really bad tear, I might say,
I'm sorry.
I might also cross my legs a little.
Yes. So it's really interesting. And we also, there's a saying that we hear really, really often where people will say, oh, I'm sorry you had a cesarean, but really the outcome is healthy mom and healthy baby. And
yes.
Absolutely. I mean, we all want a healthy mom and a healthy baby. Like nobody's denying that.
Yeah.
But I don't think we should minimize what birthing people have went through. I think that that's not okay. And to kind of empathize with the fact that, yeah, I mean, their birth plan went really left field, right? And the recovery of that, both emotionally and physically, can be really challenging.
For sure. So for folks, if you run into someone who says, "Oh, we had a C-section," you take a line from your lovely doulas, and you say, "Oh, tell me about that."
Like congratulations, right?
Of course.
Yeah, absolutely.
How exciting! Yeah. Tell me more.
Absolutely. Like I think too, and I do think though that there's lots of different postpartum support groups. There's lots of groups that focus on cesarean birth. So if you are having a little bit of trouble kind of coming to terms with that, then it's okay to have a conversation with someone about it. It's okay to feel kind of down or a little bit sad. For me personally, and it's so funny because I think everybody has a different thing that they kind of miss in terms of their birth. So for me, for the birth of my second child, my son, who was a cesarean as well, it was funny because my friends would talk to me about kind of the ring of fire, like when you push your baby out. And for some reason that, I was really sad that I missed that, which anyone who's dealt with that is probably like, Jesus, what's wrong with you? But for me, for some reason, I really had to mourn the fact that I didn't physically get to push my baby out. And I think it's different for everybody. But for me, that was something that I was like, oh, that's such a bummer. I'm never going to feel what that's like, right? I'm never going to know what transition is. Because I never got that far. So I'm never really going to understand what that feels like. So for me, that was kind of where my kind of grieving was. And I don't even know why, but for everybody it's different, right? Some people, it can be something else.
Exactly. Other people might be sort of mourning the fact that they didn't get that moment of, their tiny sort of warm, slimy baby on their belly.
Yeah.
And having that traditional skin to skin moment.
Yeah.
Moments immediately after birth.
Yeah. Or that rush, that rush of oxytocin, that doesn't come after a cesarean. You don't get that, right? That comes later.
Loopy kind of.
You're a little high.
Yeah, that mix of and oxytocin and everything mixed in together, making you kind of oh my God.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you don't really experience that, right? It's not that same, it's not the same vibe for sure.
Exactly. I mean, the vast majority of people who are the folks who are birthing, are people who have uteruses. The people who have uteruses tend to grow up in a culture where they're extra critical of themselves.
Yeah.
So we have an infinite capacity for finding minutia to be upset and disappointed over in ourselves. So
and what our bodies can do, right? I mean, a lot of that is really connected to how we feel about our bodies and how, we were designed to do this. And all I can say too is, and I tell this to all my clients, and for me too, this was the truth. I mean, thank God for modern medicine. Yeah. Right. Thank God that we can have babies via cesareans because we have saved a lot of lives that way. And that's just the truth.
Yeah.
Right. And, 100 years ago, it would be extremely different. Yeah. So
absolutely. 100 years ago, we were losing mothers in and shortly after childbirth a lot.
Yeah.
Far more than people realize.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Because women were maybe they were laboring at home and in what we consider kind of this pastoral, beautiful way that old-timey people birthed.
Yeah.
But, if you were in labor for 4 or 5 days straight, you might just die eventually of loss because
I think, I think there are some women who maybe physiologically their pelvis just isn't designed for a baby to go through it. And we don't know that until, people die and we do autopsies. Like, we just don't know, right? Why some women just can't.
And so there's lots of things we did in the very beginning. We touched on a number of sort of medical things that lead to unplanned cesareans. So problems with the placenta rupturing, the uterus rupturing, the baby's heart rate going down very dramatically and not coming back up pretty quickly. Really prolonged birthing periods, failure to progress. And those are just addressing stuff that's happening within an active sort of labor.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And then there's the other things that are not sort of medical reasons, but like your pelvis you just might have a more male patterned pelvis than anybody realizes. And it's just not possible for a whole human to get through that space because pelvis and female, pelvises are quite large and male pelvises are quite slim.
Narrow, yeah.
There's other pelvis shapes that are more wide, slim, or that are sort of triangular but small.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of those shapes, but also babies are like spinning around for 9 months in there. And a lot of them have a tendency to wrap their cords around themselves in configuration. So some babies might wrap their cord around their arm a couple of times, and then there's no slack to allow the baby to just come down. So, you might have a client who's been pushing for 2 hours, and the first hour that baby came down really great, and then the next hour there was no forward progress whatsoever, and then eventually discovered they were wearing their cord like a backpack or a noose or something, and there was just nowhere for them to go.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and that can be really frustrating. I mean, especially if you go through all of labor, you're 10 centimeters dilated, you're 100% of face, the baby's moved down, it's time to push the baby out, and then the baby doesn't come. And that can be really, really kind of like, disappointing, I guess, is a good way to put it, right? And I mean, most people, once the baby's born, it's all good, right? But I do think there's a process where people do have to come to terms with that a little bit, for sure, absolutely. And to celebrate it. I mean, there's nothing wrong with celebrating. Did I hear somebody say the baby came out the window instead of the door?
Yeah, I've been hearing lots of different things. The sunroof, I've heard.
Yeah.
So.
And it's great to tell those stories. Like when I tell my kids the story of their birth, I mean, it was a pretty PG version when they were little, but as they get older, I was like, this is the way it happened. Like you had to mommy's, abdomen had to get cut open and you had to come out that way. And that was just the way you needed to be born. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, for sure.
And you can construct as you sort of process what has happened for yourself. You can reconstruct your birth as the sort of fairy tale it should be, just with different features.
Yeah.
And maybe your sister's birth looked like if she had a more sort of traditional vaginal birth.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So I just think that, I mean, I think it should be celebrated. I also think that it should be, researched a little bit more. If you're that kind of person, I think you should talk to your doula about it, your care provider. You should read that section in the book. I think that it kind of helps you just kind of be a little bit more prepared. We talk a lot about birth. We talk about interventions. We talk about medicated birth, not medicated birth, but we tend to kind of skip over the cesarean section. And I was guilty of that too. I just like didn't even pay attention because I wasn't going to be the person who gave birth that way. And yeah, so I think everyone should just like kind of have that knowledge going in, and then everyone's a little bit more prepared to deal with it.
Absolutely. So learning about C-section, being flexible to include the possibility of surgical birth in your general plan, whether you're creating a formal written plan or you just have an idea in your head of the way you really like birth to go. It's super important, just like we have to think, well, what if I do need an epidural? We have to think, what if I do need a surgical birth?
Yeah.
You know, what if I am having a cesarean to give birth to this baby? We have to include that possibility and have our hearts open to it as well.
Yeah, I think that's that's a really nice way to put it. I mean, having your heart open to it for sure. I think that's that's a nice way to put it.
Yeah, and looking and learning about cesarean, not in a way like, how can I avoid this? In a way of, how can I understand how this happens, why these kinds of things can happen, and then how that transition from expected vaginal delivery over to an expected cesarean is going to happen, what that looks like, so it's less unexpected for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Just kind of like keeping all those options like on the table. Like these are and at the end of the day, we don't know how any birth is going to go. Like nobody knows. Like we don't know. The doctor doesn't know. You don't know. So kind of having all those options on the table and just like being aware of them is, I think, important. Absolutely. Yeah, being informed is always like, you know, information is power, right? So the more informed we are, the better we're prepared to deal with it.
And then in the midst of labor, when your midwife and doctor, because if you do have midwives, you're going to have an OB come in to talk to you if the midwife suspects that a switch to a C-section may be happening or may be warranted, right? So your OB, your family practitioner and your midwife, when those people are talking to you about the strong chance of moving to C-section, and I've got to give it to them, at least here in Hamilton, generally what we see is, even when it's really obvious that the next logical step is to move to a cesarean, I'm so happy when I see the doctors always say, you know, we think this should be the thing that we do. What do you think? And they give the client, the patient, the chance to talk about it and to verbally process things. And I think I always recommend to my clients that when that decision is being made, and I always point out, if they're having a calm conversation saying, we believe that the next, like what we should do next is, you've got time to take some time for yourself. If you come in and say, okay, so here's what we think needs to happen, and there's suddenly an energetic buzz around you and other people are coming in the room, maybe they haven't seen before, and they're starting to do things, that's when you know that this is going to move really quickly. And they really are looking for you to give your verbal consent and then sign off on anything that needs to be signed off in an efficient fashion. So if that buzz isn't happening around you, absolutely ask for 10 to 15 minutes alone to discuss with your partner. And if you happen to have maybe a midwife or a doula with you, or another, if you're very lucky and things have opened up enough to have a trusted friend or family member with you, then have a little powwow session with those people. Have a little chat session with them so you can just hash through things. And when you have that session, I want you to look at what has led up to this. So to help yourself from feeling like this was a sudden decision, that you were robbed from what should be a vaginal delivery, try to think about the path that your birth has taken, because we often see tiny little signposts along the way that say, well, this isn't going exactly normally.
Right.
This isn't going exactly normally. So the next logical thing is that the birth is going to start to turn this particular corner.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes when you look at those things and start to recognize them, you can say, oh yeah, like maybe this was my destined birth plan.
Yeah.
Or my body sort of knew it was going to go this way. The universe maybe had this in its sights for me.
Yeah.
And it can feel, having those kinds of discussions and processes can really take some of that overwhelm out of the situation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you're right. Like having that informed conversation with, like your partner, or your doula, or whoever, it kind of helps you take a little bit more control of it. And I think that's one of the things that's the hardest thing, is that control over your birth has been taken away. And that's, I think, where people kind of come into, having a little bit of a problem with that. Yeah. And then it's more of like an informed decision. And you're right. I mean, that would happen in a more like unplanned cesarean. I mean, if it's a real true emergency, those decisions are taken from you for a reason, right? Yeah. And then they just, if it's really imminent. But I think just having like a little bit of that control and that informed decision making is really, really important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And ask your care providers questions. Like,
absolutely.
There will be as many questions as you want. And I empower everyone to ask the OB hard questions too. So we had one client who was having an incredibly difficult birth, and the OB came in. She was a midwifery client, but they asked the OB to come in because the pushing phase was not going as easily, and it was taking quite a while.
Yeah.
OB did an exam, and the OB said to me, there appears to be no barriers to continuing forward. And the client said, I just don't think I can keep pushing. Like, it's been 3 hours. I can't keep doing this.
Yeah.
I'm very anxious overall. And the OB said, no problem. We can do a C-section. I think that's an entirely reasonable choice. Mm-hmm. So it's lovely that the choice pathway.
Yeah.
Client.
Yeah.
We agreed that that option was on the table and viable. So they talked about it for a few minutes. And the husband was super nervous about the whole thing. He really didn't want this to happen. Mm-hmm. And he was also, he had a little insider knowledge about infectious diseases and things, and infection pathways because of the job that he did. So he turned to the doctor and he said, when was the last time someone died in your operating room? And me, part of the culture where, I'm very collaborative with the OBs I work for, but I'm very also like, they're pretty smart people.
They know what they're doing. Yeah.
I was like, oh my goodness. And the OB did not blink. He didn't skip a beat. And he thought for a moment, and I think this birth was happening in July.
Yeah.
And he said, oh, that would have been in April. And it was the person passed away because they had an amniotic embolism, which is something that is completely random. Like, it's something that can't be proven.
Rare. Yeah.
Don't know what's going to happen, and very rare.
Yeah.
So that's what he just said that.
Yeah.
And then the husband thought for a minute. He went, okay.
And maybe they were and maybe the husband was just that kind of person where he's just extremely informative, and he was like, I need the facts and I need them straight. Yeah.
And so,
yeah,
if folks out there need that information or have questions, don't worry about offending your care provider.
No, they'll just tell you.
Laughable. For the most part. Yeah, they'll answer and they'll get you the information, because they know sometimes that kind of information helps process and move forward in the decision-making process.
Yeah. And if anybody's ever been in an OR, whether as a patient or as, a visitor. It is really serious in there. They are extremely good at what they do.
Yeah.
It is clean, concise, like decisions are being made. It is you feel really confident in the ORs with the surgeons. I mean, they're just good at what they do, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's a thing that has very clear boundaries.
Absolutely.
Vaginal birthing doesn't really have clear boundaries because there's so many factors at play. When you get into the operating room, suddenly the level, like the playing field levels out, the doctor just goes at it and does what they need to do.
Yeah.
And the whole thing takes about 20 minutes, 40 minutes max.
It's
take their time. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really, really fast. I think people are really shocked at how quick it is. Like often if it's an unplanned cesarean, often the partners will turn to their doula and say like, how long is this going to take? And when I tell them, they're like shocked. I'm like, it's in and out.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I'll see you in about 20 minutes.
20 minutes, yeah. I'll meet you in recovery. Well, before COVID, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So, Meghan, how can people afterwards help themselves process what has happened to them?
I think just really talking about it, honestly. Like, I think any kind of postpartum support group in your community, we have some here, you obviously have some in Hamilton, are really important. There are ones specifically for cesarean births. So it's really good to chat about that. And like find other parents in your community who have had cesarean births and have those conversations with them, because your birth journey is quite different than, your friend or your sister, whoever who had a vaginal birth. Like it is a different journey. And I think just like talking about it and also knowing that it's okay to grieve the vaginal birth you didn't have. And it's okay to do that months later. I mean, some people that comes 6 months after the fact when they're like, oh God, like, and especially if they're not having another baby, or if they know if they have another baby, it's recommended to have another cesarean, like a planned cesarean for whatever reason. So I think just like really talking about it, sharing it, not being afraid to talk about your birth story in a positive way, because there's nothing negative about a cesarean birth. It's just the way your baby needed to come into the world. So yeah, reach out to your community, find other parents who have had similar experiences and just really kind of own it. Right?
For sure. And I think we can all, moving forward, influence the culture of birthing for the better by greeting people who tell us that they've had a C-section birth with joy and excitement.
Yeah.
Really reinforce. And I mean, and if they don't feel the same way that we are portraying, they can tell us and we can modulate our response, right?
Absolutely.
If Meghan, you say to me, oh yeah, like I had a baby last year, and I say, how did that go? And you say, oh, well, we had a C-section. And I can say, oh, that's amazing. Oh, and you go, well, actually, like, I'm really a wreck about it. And, I'm having trouble getting over it. Then I can pull back and go, wow, do you want to talk about that? Is that support for that? And then we can help them understand that it's definitely a process that they can move through, much in the same way as grieving death is a process, right? Yeah. Grieving the loss of your original birth vision and your original birth dream is a process that, as you said, can take months, and sometimes those feelings are with you years and years later.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We certainly have people in our lives who have, they're still mad that they had a C-section, or they're still sad about it, or they still feel a different parent for some reason, because they have created a script in their head around that, and the general culture has reinforced that. So we can to change that.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because all birth is beautiful, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks so much. I think that was this was a really good and important conversation.
Yeah.
We usually doulas focus on trying to avoid C-sections, but honestly, whatever happens. And we just, I think it's best for us to kind of roll with those punches a lot of the times.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
So thanks everyone for joining us. I saw a few of you on the live there. If anyone has any questions, please leave them in the comments and we will come back and answer them for you. If you are looking for some support, please reach out to us by DM, and definitely get hooked up to our newsletter. We've got one going out tomorrow morning. So if you are able to watch this on Wednesday, the day it's recorded, then if you can get signed up, you can get on the newsletter list. And last week I sent out some fun social media graphics people can use to tell people to lay off asking them if they've had their baby already. We've had awesome handouts. Every week we make a handout, and this week will be no different. So get signed up so you can get your hands on that exclusive free materials.
Awesome.
And if you are in the Ottawa, Toronto, or Hamilton area, a little birdie told me that there might be a little sale happening next week.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. So if you're looking for support, really, seriously, DM us. You want in on this. All right. Have a wonderful day, folks.
Bye, guys.
Bye.